I have the task to perhaps talk about women and social security. And Valerie, as well as Christian, coming from human rights perspective, has made my task a little bit easier. Christian shared the three various frameworks that exist which provide for what social security is, or what consists of social security. One is the ILO, the human rights, as well as the human rights-based approach. From a women's perspective, let's critically look at all three and see where the challenges are and where the gaps are. In ILO's framework, in the resolution 102, it highlights the 9 contingencies for social security. However, when you look from a gender perspective, the very critical one which it doesn't highlight is violence. Violence is a reality globally for women, and violence does add to women's vulnerability. I'm not talking about just domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, as well as conflict and war, riots, all add to the risk in which people live, and therefore violence should be a contingency for social security. It talks about unemployment, but it doesn't talk about loss of livelihood. From the part of the world I come from, Global South, most people are not in wage work. It's not about employment, it's about livelihoods, living close to nature and providing for adequate standard of living or food security for life with dignity. So loss of livelihood is a very, very critical issue, and development policies as well as natural disasters or various man-made disasters adds to the vulnerability of loss of livelihood. So those two things, important contingencies to be included in ILOs. Now let's come to human rights. Human rights elaborates in its core obligation the realization of 5 basic rights as the core understanding of social security of basic levels. The 5 basic rights which Christian shared as the adequate standard of living, which we understand as food, housing, water, sanitation, health, education. Again, in this, the idea of decent work and livelihood is not included. 5 basic rights, yes, they provide for, but the adequate standard of living without articulating it in terms of decent work as well as livelihood is a missing gap. So what happens, like, for example, in a country like India, where we have this National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which provides for 100 days of unskilled guaranteed employment. But in absence of guarantee of livelihood, so at one hand, the government can be in development projects snatching away, or there are loss of livelihoods, and other end, the government is coming with social assistance programs with providing Rural Employment Guarantee Act. So livelihood, very important component of it. Now let's look at the human rights-based approach. That the transformative nature of social protection or social security systems is very important. And at the heart of it is inequality addressing. It's not just about providing for so that you can quote-unquote survive. How you address inequality, poverty, vulnerability, and the issue of social justice is at the heart of social security system, or should be at the heart of social security system. And that's where the human rights-based approach to social security comes in. From human rights community, we are extremely grateful to ILO, because what we were not able to achieve, ILO's recommendation 202 has provided us, universality. Even though the universality principle is at the heart of human rights, but correct me if I'm wrong, the way the right to social security was being articulated, it was still understood as a workers' rights and not as a universal social security for everyone. But ILO's recommendation 202 has taken it and moved it beyond, making it truly a universal human right. And so from human rights perspective, it's a huge transformation that has happened. However, universality continues to be and still is one of the very critical challenges in realization of right to social security. It's most complex when it comes to implementing it at national level. Of course, the governments from our parts of the world, again, from developing countries, the whole issue of resources come in, and the approach is usually targeted. Let's target the most vulnerable, and then progressively we'll make it universal. It also, in a case of limited resources, the issue also becomes that why shouldn't we give it to the most vulnerable, and why should the social security or social assistance programs be for the those who don't need it. But universality is therefore, it becomes very challenging, and there are various arguments about it. One of the arguments which we use in India, for example, talking with our bureaucrats, is the universality doesn't mean, the universality principle of human rights doesn't mean that you need to give it to everyone. The universality principle of human rights means that you ensure no one is left behind. So if how you design the program, if you can design it to ensure that no one who needs it is left behind, if by targeting you can do it, target it. But if you can't design it to make sure not even one person is left behind, then you have to give it to everyone. You have no choice. In our conversations with women's groups in South Asia, in India, universality was further unpacked. Universal but not uniform. So understanding the diversity of the various communities and women who live in various realities and the whole life cycle approach, one form of social security is not going to actually meet the vulnerability and needs of everyone. Therefore, in universality, we are asking for universality but not uniform. So how do you design it? That becomes very, very important.